And today I'd like to spend a few minutes talking with you about the prophet Isaiah. And I'd like to look at the talk in three parts. I'd like to talk a little bit about the time in which Isaiah lived and ministered, and talk a little bit about the man himself. And last, I'd like to talk about some specifics of the book of Isaiah and look at a few key verses as well as the way the book is organized and what we can learn from this book. So, the times in which Isaiah lived was a time of great difficulty for the kingdoms of Israel and of Judah. The kingdom was divided at this point of time. And when Isaiah began his ministry, it was actually in the last year of one of the most successful kings of Judah. He's known by the name of Amaziah and also Uzziah. Uzziah started out his reign as a very God-fearing and great man. And while he was king, he restored and expanded the borders of Judah to the borders almost of the time of Solomon, except for the northern kingdom, of course. He defeated the Philistines for the final time, made them pay tribute, collected tribute from Moab and Ammon, and Edom. And the country was very strong during his reign. He built up the walls around Jerusalem. He established other fortresses. The country was very prosperous. However, Uzziah became proud, and he tried to take the role of the priest in offering incense in the temple on the altar of incense. And because of his pride and arrogance, he was struck with leprosy. And he was forced to abdicate, and his son ruled in his stead the last few years of his life. And in the last year of Uzziah's life, Isaiah was called to serve as a prophet. The kingdom at that time was very strong, but in the years that followed, threats were to come. There was a rising power in the north, Assyria. Assyria was located in what is today modern-day Iraq, and it was slowly spreading out from this area. It was conquering its neighbors and establishing an empire which would eventually be the largest of its time. And during the time that Isaiah served as a prophet, Assyria rose to power and threatened its neighbors, invaded and destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel, and also invaded Judah and threatened its very existence. And so during Isaiah's lifetime, Judah saw a great change of its prosperity and its success. It went from one of its highest points of advancement and size of its kingdom and power to struggling for its very survival when the Assyrians surrounded Jerusalem and captured most of the other major cities of the kingdom. And as a society, Judah was very prosperous at the beginning of Isaiah's ministry. The rich were very rich, the poor were very poor. There was quite a bit of social inequality, a situation we see today in many Western countries, and not even just Western countries. And the rich did not have much concern for the poor. They took advantage of them. They used their money and their power and prestige to oppress them further. We have the English expression, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. That was certainly the situation in the kingdom of Judah during the time that Isaiah ministered. Isaiah himself was of the royal family. His father was the brother of the king. The king was his uncle. We don't know if he had other brothers and sisters. He certainly wasn't directly in line to the throne, but he was a member of the royal family. He had access to the palace, and he was very well educated. Isaiah is sometimes called the Shakespeare of the prophets because of his high level of language, the broad vocabulary that he uses, the various kinds of literary styles that he uses in his writing. He's a very creative and artistic writer, a descriptive writer, very different from some of the other prophets who had very simple and basic educations. His books are filled with metaphors and very colorful descriptions that he uses in getting his points across. Isaiah was married. He had 2 sons. His wife was referred to as a prophetess herself, although we don't have any messages of what she preached or what messages she received. She is referred to as a prophetess. Isaiah served as a prophet for about 60 years. He served during the reigns of 4 kings of Israel, of Judah, and probably into the reign of a 5th, Manasseh. Manasseh was a very wicked son of Hezekiah, and it is believed that Isaiah was put to death by Manasseh because Manasseh was very much against anyone who followed God. The histories record him as spilling the blood of the righteous. Anyone who was a strong supporter of God, he put to death and executed. According to Jewish tradition, Isaiah was executed by being put into a log and sawed in half. And there's reference to this even in the New Testament, in Paul's writings, although he doesn't mention by name. There is a mention of someone being cut asunder, and we believe that's referring to Isaiah. However, at the time that he died, Isaiah was quite old. He was probably in his 80s or 90s, so he had lived a very long and successful life working as a prophet for God. And he had actually more or less retired from active service at the time of his death. Most of the messages that he wrote and the things that he recorded, he had already completed by the time that Manasseh executed him. One of the kings that is most famous in connection with Isaiah is, of course, Hezekiah. Hezekiah was a good king of Israel. He strove to do right in the eyes of God. And there are 2 particular stories that are connected with Isaiah and Hezekiah, times that Isaiah counseled Hezekiah or gave warning to Hezekiah. The first of these was, of course, the invasion of Assyria, which I mentioned earlier. The kingdom of Assyria was expanding very aggressively. They had destroyed the northern kingdom earlier, and the southern kingdom of Judah had been paying tribute to Assyria under Hezekiah's father, Ahaz. But when Hezekiah came to the throne, he decided to rebel against Assyria. He refused to pay the tribute. And naturally, the Assyrians did not like people not paying taxes, just like every other government. And so the Assyrians sent their armies, and the emperor himself came and invaded Judah. And in a very quick campaign, almost all of Judah was overrun, and all of the major cities were stormed and captured. And only Jerusalem itself remained free. And the armies of Assyria surrounded Jerusalem, and the emperor thought it was such an easy job that he himself did not even stay to supervise the capture of Jerusalem. He took his army and went south to fight the Egyptians, who had come north in support of Judah. And at this time, the Assyrians were very arrogant, and their ambassadors and their general addressed the people of Jerusalem and the king in a very condescending and proud way. None of your cities have survived. None of your allies have survived. The gods of your neighbors have not saved you. Your God has not saved any of your other cities. Why do you think your God will save you? And the leaders and the king were greatly distressed, of course. And they put on sackcloth and ashes and prayed as to what should be done. And Hezekiah came with a message to the king that he was not to worry, that their enemies would be taken care of by God. They had nothing to fear. If they put their trust in God, if they resisted Assyria, God would be their salvation. And of course, I'm sure many of you know the story. In one night, a destroying angel passed through the Assyrian camp, and over 100,000 Assyrians were slain in the night. And when the survivors woke up in the morning, they panicked, of course, and fled. And the king himself, the emperor himself, was forced to flee back to Assyria because of this disaster. And he himself was assassinated by his own sons a short time thereafter. And the people of Judah were never threatened by Assyria again. And the second story, famous story of Isaiah in Hezekiah, came a few years later. Hezekiah became very sick. And he asked God what was going to happen to him through Isaiah. And Isaiah told him, "You're going to die." The king was still quite young. He was only maybe in his 30s or 40s at the time. And so he prayed very impassionedly to God and pleaded that God save him from this illness. And God heard the king's prayer, and even before Isaiah had left the palace, God told Isaiah to return to the king and tell him that another 15 years would be added to his life. And the king asked for a sign for that this would actually come to pass. And Isaiah said, "Well, you have an option. Well, you have two choices. Here in your palace, there is a sundial built into the palace. Solomon had created a very interesting clock. He had created a staircase in the palace, and that staircase was matched to the sun. Each step represented a period of time. So simply by looking at the shadow that fell on the stairs, you could tell the time of day." And so Isaiah told the king, "You have a choice. You can advance the time of day, or you can cause the time of day to move back. You can move up or down the staircase." And the king thought, and he said, "Well, time moving forward, that happens naturally. So, ask God to move the shadow back." And God performed that sign, and the sun moved back a number of degrees up that staircase. And the story, this miracle, had reverberations that were international. Because far away in the city of Babylon, there were astronomers. The Babylonians were famous for watching the stars, charting the stars, and charting the sun. They practiced astrology, where they predicted the future based on the movement of the planets and the sun and the stars. And these astronomers were amazed when the sun moved back. And when they searched their records, they could find no other instance in the recorded history of this ever happening. And so they began to make inquiries. On this date, this happened. And through their various contacts and ambassadors and business traders, they discovered that something had happened in Judah on that day. That a miracle had been performed and the king had been healed of a disease. And so the king of Babylon sent a delegation to visit this country of Judah. And he wanted to find out about the country and their king and their God who had performed this miraculous event. Now at this time, Babylon was not a very important kingdom. In fact, it was simply a city-state, and it was under the thumb of Assyria. They paid tribute to Assyria at that time. They were not an independent kingdom. But they did send this delegation to visit Hezekiah. And Hezekiah was very happy to receive a delegation from so far away. Babylon was quite some distance from Jerusalem. It was about a 2 or 3 month journey by caravan route. And so he was very proud to have this foreign delegation come to see him. And he showed them his entire kingdom. He took them on a tour and showed them his vineyards and his cities and his palaces and his villas. And he opened up his treasure house and showed them the various things that had been stored up and saved by the kings up until that point in time. And finally, he wished them well, and they departed. And they returned to Babylon with the stories of what they had seen and the wealth that Hezekiah had accumulated. And Isaiah came to see Hezekiah, and he said, "Well, what did you do?" "Oh, I showed them everything." And Isaiah said, "Well, what you showed them, they will take. Everything that you showed them, they will take someday." And Hezekiah had been so proud of his riches and treasures, and he had showed them these things instead of really witnessing and testifying about God and the source of his healing and power. And Hezekiah accepted the condemnation. Like David, he was not a proud man. He wasn't like some of the other kings who got angry with the prophets. He always accepted Isaiah's counsel and rebuke. And he said, "Well, at least it won't happen when I'm alive." It's God's judgment. When it comes, it comes. But I'm thankful that in His mercy He doesn't allow it to happen while I am still king. And, of course, several generations later, about 100 years later, those prophecies came to pass when Nebuchadnezzar and his armies came and sacked the city. I'd like to talk for just a few minutes last about the book of Isaiah itself. The book of Isaiah is divided into 2 sections, roughly. The first 39 chapters are referred to as the Assyrian period. And these chapters deal a lot with the judgment of God against Israel and against Judah. A warning of what would happen, and the rise of Assyria, and the devastation that would come from the Assyrians. And the second 27 chapters deal more with hope and comfort. They're promises of salvation, promises of restoration. That's sometimes called the Babylonian section because they were verses which refer to the return from captivity and the restoration. Some people think that it's interesting how the book of Isaiah is written and divided. There are 66 chapters in Isaiah, and there are 66 books in the Bible. And the 39 chapters of the judgment, condemnation, and warning match the 39 books of the Old Testament, which are also focus a lot of warning and judgment declared against God's people through the prophets and through the history that's contained there. And of course, the 27 books of comfort and hope match the 27 books of the New Testament, which of course deal with Christ and the message of salvation. And so that parallel is considered an interesting coincidence, or perhaps planned even, by scholars who have analyzed the book of Isaiah. And of course, Isaiah is a very, very long book, and I don't have time to go through every chapter and every verse. But I would like to just share with you a few key texts from Isaiah. Of course, one was the one we used for our scripture this morning, about Isaiah 6, verse 8. And in this verse, which is the verse that reflects Isaiah's first response to the call that God, when God called him. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" And I said, "Here I am, send me." Isaiah was willing to respond when he was called. He was not trained really to be a prophet. He had not gone to the school of the prophets. And yet, when God called him to serve, he was willing to do so. And of course, as Christians, we have to have that same attitude. That regardless of our training, regardless of our situation, regardless of our background, if God calls us to serve, we need to be willing to stand up and to help in whatever way we can. Each of us has special gifts and special talents, and we're each in special situations where we can reach and touch people that no one else can reach. And so, if God calls you to serve, we need to be willing to respond as Isaiah did and say, "Send me." Of course, Isaiah is very famous for many of the prophecies about Christ, and just a few of these. Isaiah 7:14. "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will be with child, and will give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel." So Isaiah contains the prophecy of the virgin birth. And of course, that was fulfilled when Mary was conceived by the Holy Spirit and gave birth to Jesus. Isaiah 6:9, or 9:6, another very famous passage. "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." I'm sure all of you are familiar with this verse because it's part of the very famous Christmas song, The Messiah, written by Handel, and who drew most of the words of the Messiah come from the book of Isaiah. Another very famous passage from Isaiah is found in Isaiah chapter 14, verses 12 and 13, and actually in other verses before and after, referring to the fall of Lucifer. "How you have fallen from heaven, O morning star, son of the dawn. You have been cast down to earth, you who once laid low the nations. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the mount of assembly, on the utmost heights of the sacred mountain." And in Isaiah we have this very short history of the fall of Satan. And in that chapter it talks about the creation of Lucifer and how he came to fall. And so that's another very famous passage from the book. And of course Isaiah 53, which we read in the responsive reading, is perhaps one of the most famous passages from Isaiah. It describes the suffering and the death and the resurrection of the Messiah. And again, a very famous part of Isaiah used in the Messiah, written by Handel. So many people are familiar with those verses and passages as they are used for the words of the songs of that famous oratorio, usually performed at Christmas, even here in Japan. One last verse I'd like to look at, Isaiah 65:25. Another very famous passage. We're talking about the new earth. The wolf and the lamb will feed together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. The dust will be the serpent's food. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountains, says the Lord. And so in Isaiah, there are many verses promising what the new world will be like after the second coming. And so a point of hope and reassurance for us as Christians today. So there are many reasons why we should study the book of Isaiah. First of all, it increases our faith in Jesus as we see the prophecies of the Messiah and how they were fulfilled so literally as we look at the life of Christ and compare the prophecies to what happened in Jesus' own life. We can see that our hope in God can be stronger as we see how these prophecies about Israel and Judah came to pass. Events were foretold 100, 200 years before, and these events were fulfilled as we study the history of the Jews and compare them to the prophecies that Isaiah made. It inspires our love for God and the Messiah as we read of the blessings to be found in the obedience to His Word. There are many promises in Isaiah, especially talking about the new heaven and the new earth, and if we are faithful, how we can live in that land. These prophecies had a dual meaning. They were given to the Jews, telling them that they would be restored after their captivity, and as Christians today, we know that they apply to us equally. As if we are faithful to God, we will be able to live in a new and restored world in the future. And finally, we see how God controlled and moved through the actions of nations and kingdoms. And we can be reassured that God is in control, not just of the past, but in the future today. Sometimes we look around us and we see the evil in the world. We see the problems and the troubles, the disasters that take place, the unrest in many places. And we wonder, how can there be a God when there is so much wickedness and so much trouble in the world today? And we know that although we live in an evil world, as we study the Bible, we see that at every time, even though there was great wickedness in the world, God was still in control. And God worked through these tragedies and events to guide people to a better future. And if we rely and trust on God, in God, that we too can come through these troubled times and be ready for Him when He returns. Today I've talked a little bit about Isaiah, looking at a little bit about the man, his times in the book. And I encourage you, as you have time, to study into the book of Isaiah. There are many, many beautiful promises to be found in its chapters. And the histories can reassure us today. As we see how God worked in the past, we can be sure He will work with us in the future. Thank you.
Our closing song.